Go ahead and get started. It looks like we have quite a few people here and some folks still rolling in. Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mary Catherine Alexander. I'm a member of the staff here at the School of Theology. I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni and Church Relations. We offer these lunch and learn sessions just as an opportunity to connect with our faculty and to hear about their research, their publications, and other topics of interest. So I am here today to introduce our presenter, the Reverend Dr. Hilary Bogert-Winkler, who is the Assistant Professor of Liturgy at the School of Theology. Prior to her arrival in Sewanee, she served as Director of Pastoral Studies at Montreal Diocesan Theological College and was affiliate faculty in the School of Religious Studies at McGill University. She studied history and religious studies as an undergraduate at Western Kentucky University, after which she attended Harvard Divinity School and Yale Divinity School for her seminary education. She was raised up for the priesthood in the Diocese of Kentucky, and upon ordination served at both parish and diocesan levels in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts. While in New England, she completed her PhD in history at the University of Connecticut. Her academic interests lie in the ways politics and religions intersected in early modern Britain and Ireland, particularly in how these intersections showed up in the liturgy. We've allotted some time for questions at the end, so feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A box. I'll keep track of them as we go along. We plan to conclude today around 1:00 p.m. Central Time. So Hilary, I will hand it over to you to get started.
Great, thanks so much. Welcome everyone. I'm so glad you've joined us today. I'm looking forward to exploring this oft overlooked bit of Anglican liturgical and ecclesiological history with you this afternoon. And this is working off some research I'm doing right now about a particular moment in the history of the prayer book in the Church of Ireland and its connection to the wider history of the Anglican Communion. So one of the most formative moments in Anglican history, and indeed part of the reason we can talk about Anglicanism as a distinct form of Christianity, happens in Britain and Ireland in the 1640s and 1650s, when there were multiple conflicts between the English monarch Charles I and his supporters, and those who wished for a different religious and/or political reality. So in Scotland, these get started in the late 1630s, become known as the Bishops' Wars. In Ireland, this starts with the Irish Rebellion in 1641 and would continue with Oliver Cromwell's brutal campaign there in the 1650s. And in England, there would be civil war in the 1640s, which would result in the trial and execution of Charles I and rule by Cromwell and Parliament until Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660. The Church of England and its colonial offshoots in Wales and Ireland are caught up in the midst of all of this conflict. So today I'm going to tell you about what happens in Ireland when they try to take away the Book of Common Prayer in 1647 and why it matters for how we understand the Anglican Communion and its history. On the 4th of January, 1645, Parliament issued an ordinance for taking away the Book of Common Prayer and for establishing and putting in execution of the Directory for the Public Worship of God. This ordinance officially made illegal the prayer book and put in its place the Directory, which provided a very different approach to the Church's liturgy than what had come before. There's a subcommittee tasked by something Parliament created called the Westminster Assembly, and the subcommittee is given the task of reforming the prayer book. But the records we have are very sparse, though the Directory itself provides an overview of the general approach to liturgical change that Parliament was taking. The reasons, they say, for reforming the liturgy were several and harken back to previous Puritan critiques of the prayer book that had emerged in the mid-16th century. The ceremonies found there were considered unprofitable and burdensome. There were too many prayers that were required to be read. Those of tender conscience, they said, were removed from ministry because they could not conform to the prayer book. They said it became an idol to the people and claimed that the liturgy was considered to be too close to that of the Catholic Church. What emerged in its place from this subcommittee was a book of rubrics meant to guide clergy in their prayers, but which placed the burden of liturgical composition on the individual clergyman. This allowed for extemporaneous prayers to be more present in the public worship of the Church, which, as I'll show in a moment, was anathema to Church of England supporters for a number of reasons. Other clergy who didn't choose to pray extemporaneously could still write their own prayers beforehand, taking into account the pastoral concerns of the congregation. The Directory provided extensive rubrics to guide those clergy. Now, it's not clear how many parishes actually obeyed this ordinance from Parliament to get rid of the prayer book. Historian John Morrill estimates that within 6 months, no more than 10% of parishes in England had actually acquired the book. And there were a little over 9,000 positions within England at the time. So we're talking about hundreds of parishes actually buy the book. The rest seemed not to have. And it seems that compliance was so poor that in August of 1645, Parliament felt the need to pass an ordinance for the more effectual putting in execution the Directory for Public Worship in all parish churches and chapels. In this ordinance, they acknowledged that they had made no provision for getting the directory into parishes, nor set down any penalties for failure to use it. They used this ordinance to correct that mistake. Failure to use the directory could result in a £5 fine for the first offense, a £10 fine for the second, and a year's imprisonment for the third. Morrill notes, however, that there is not a known instance of this penalty being enforced. Now, for those committed to the worship and structure of the Church of England, Parliament's reforms were devastating. The prayer book was banned, as I said, in January of 1645. Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, was executed that same month. And in October of 1646, the episcopacy was abolished in England and Wales. In the midst of these trials, and remember, there is a war going on, not to be able to pray publicly according to the received liturgical tradition of the church was considered particularly problematic, because for English people in the mid-17th century, the form of your prayers had a direct connection to the political and social realities of the nation. They believed that the prayers and fasts of the English people had to be presented in the best possible form. Those who supported the prayer book thought this form should be the structured prayers they had used for almost a century, while others, among them those who put together the directory, believed that only extemporaneous prayers inspired by the Holy Spirit would suffice. Apologists in England, those apologists for the Church of England, made a number of arguments against extemporaneous prayers in public worship. And that's a really key distinction here. They have no problem with people praying extemporaneously in their homes, but they mean in the official public worship of the Church of England. So they made a number of arguments against it. And they said, for example, the uneducated clergy's extemporaneous prayers would introduce heresy into the congregation. They pointed out that not every minister was furnished with the gift of praying extemporaneously. They claimed that the congregation could not give an earnest amen to prayers they had not heard before. In other words, common prayer is no longer common. Furthermore, there are no more congregational responses to and participation in the prayers. Rather, the laity were to participate through listening to the prayers and the sermon. One need only consult a copy of each book to see this difference in print. So, for example, if you look at a Book of Common Prayer from this period, it almost looks like a script. And for those of us who pray in an Anglican church or an Episcopal church on a Sunday morning, we would be familiar with this, the kind of back and forth between clergy and laity. The priest and the congregation each have their own clearly delineated roles. The directory, however, is largely a book of rubrics. So the italics here are rubrics. And this goes on in the directory for the rubrics for the prayer after the sermon for 14 pages. Now, these rubrics would say what a minister might say, but did not require the minister to say any of that. So those in favor of the prayer book argued that it did good for the nation in several ways. They said that it brought a general sense of order to the church and by extension to the society. Their primary scriptural support for this came from Paul, particularly the first letter to the Corinthians in a passage from the 14th chapter. Paul writes, "Let all things be done unto edifying, for God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. Let all things be done decently and in order." Furthermore, those who supported the prayer book would say that the witness of the tradition of the church also pointed to a set liturgy. Many of the prayer book's supporters, their apologists, decried the directory as innovation. And I know we live in a time when innovation is generally seen as a good thing. In the early modern period, so 16th, 17th century, innovation is seen as bad. They would go so far as to claim that those who had put together the directory were ignoring the fact that the prayer book had been written in or sealed by the blood of the martyrs of the church. So they'd claim, like, Cranmer was a martyr and his blood had sealed the prayer book. There was one odd author who even claimed that Queen Elizabeth I was a martyr, but I'm not sure what history he was reading. The authority of the church and the state were also of central importance to those who wanted the prayer book reinstated. Even if one did not hold the prayer book in high esteem, they argued, one ultimately was bound to use it because it was the only legal liturgy in the Church of England, and the clergy had a duty to uphold it. But it's worth pointing out now, and this will be important in a moment, that those legal arguments they make are kind of the least important in the ways that they, if you count it by the amount of words they write about each of these different things, they spend the least amount of time talking about the legality, the most amount of time talking about issues of order, apostolicity, historicity, things like that. Now, when we turn to Ireland, the apologetic response to the proscription of the prayer book looks incredibly different. The fortunes of the Church of Ireland during the 1640s and 50s are even less studied than those of the Church of England. There are a number of historical works that examine the Church's history in the larger 17th century, including the Irish Rebellion and its aftermath, but in general, the middle of the century lacks an in-depth analysis, particularly if we're thinking about the Church of Ireland. However, a document describing the reactions of a group of Dublin clergy to the banning of the prayer book show why it is vital that historians treat the Church of Ireland as a subject worthy of its own historical study, and also can change how we think about the beginnings of the Anglican Communion. So while the prayer book was outlawed in England in 1645, it wasn't until 1647 that this became official in Ireland. A group of Church of Ireland clergy in Dublin were confronted with the start of Parliament's attempted restructuring in 1647. In June of that year, the Marquess of Ormond and the King's Lord Lieutenant, who would become first Duke of Ormond, James Butler, signed the Dublin Articles, which surrendered Dublin to Parliament. Most importantly for the clergy, this was the same Parliament that had proscribed the prayer book in 1645 and abolished episcopacy in 1646 in England. They now brought their reforming impulses to Dublin, and the clergy were thus unsurprised to receive a notification on June 19th that they should stop using the prayer book and start using the directory. On June 22nd, a group of 19 clergy in Dublin, including the Bishop of Killaloe, presented their first response to this in manuscript form, and much of this response echoes the Church of England's apologetics on a number of points. There are, the group claims, 9 reasons for continued use of the prayer book, and these are there are clearly not 9 on that slide. I tried to group them together. Firstly, they say the spirit of absolute infallibility ceased with the apostles, and so it is necessary that a common form of prayer be agreed upon and prescribed in every national church, instead of being left to every man's private spirit. As the English authors had noted, not everyone had a talent for extemporaneous prayer, and even more alarmingly, such prayers could open the door for heresy to enter the church. Best leave extemporaneous prayer to the apostles, and since the apostles were long since gone, they needed a set form. Secondly, the way to have public prayer be as infallible as possible was thus not to leave things up to individual clergy, but to provide a form agreed upon and established by authority. The 3rd through 5th points all echoed the apostolic and biblical origins of set liturgy, which, as I said, was a key part of the English argument. In the 6th case, they said the prayer book had been established by an act of Parliament, which was still in force. And the last 3 points of the first petition look to reactions of people in Dublin. The Protestants of Dublin, they write, will be greatly offended and grieved by the loss of the prayer book. And it's worth noting is that Dublin is where the Church of Ireland was strongest in Ireland. And in the 7th and 9th points, they note that the taking away of the prayer book will cause Roman Catholics to rejoice, who want to see the downfall of the Church of Ireland, and even more, that it would, quote, be an open gap for Jesuits and other papists to enter in amongst us, possess our pulpits, and seduce the people. Concern for the Jesuits is not one that got much attention in the English apologetic literature when it relates to the prayer book, though there is a concern there about the proliferation of radical Protestant sects. We might say, then, that both this document and the English apologetics are concerned about flourishing heterodoxy and heresy, albeit in different guises. None of the points made in this first protestation is particularly surprising, given the literature coming out of England around the time. While the English apologists were writing after the prayer book had been made illegal, the points both groups of clergy made drew on similar lines of argument around the historicity and orthodoxy of the prayer book liturgy. A second protestation followed in Dublin several days later. The first was, unsurprisingly, not well received by Parliament, and on the June 24th, the commissioners ordered that the prayer book was no longer to be used and that the directory was to replace it. The commissioners also sent a message to the clergy asking if they would officiate in their churches and if they would at the very least use the directory or some such form of service as was agreeable to the word of God, provided it were not the Book of Common Prayer. The clergy met on June 25th, and from this meeting came a second petition, which did appear in print, addressed to the Honourable Commissioners for the Parliament of England, but meant for public reading, given its appearance in print form. So the first one, as far as I can tell, has only appeared in print in the 19th century, or in the early 20th century, but was in manuscript form before that. But the second one is printed. And it's in this second document that we see a marked contrast to the apologetics in England. The document in question, a declaration of the Protestant clergy of the city of Dublin, showing the reasons why they cannot consent to the taking away of the Book of Common Prayer and comply with the directory, presents 8 reasons the clergy of Dublin felt they could not dispense with the prayer book. And it's another list, I apologize, but this one's important. In the first place, they made an oath at their ordination to administer the doctrine and sacraments of the church as commanded by the Lord and as received by the realm. Secondly, they took the oath of supremacy, and only royal authority could direct them to use the directory, and King Charles I, who was still alive at this point, had not directed them to do so. 3, the Act of Parliament from Elizabeth's reign requiring the use of the prayer book, they said, was still in force. 4, the prayer book was a key part of the, and they say, communion between the Church of England and the Church of Ireland, and to dispense with it would depart from that communion, which is an intriguing point to make, given that the dismantling of the Church of England had already taken place, and the commissioners here are trying to bring the Church of Ireland into greater alignment with the Church of England. But they say, no, this is going to take us out of communion with what they're thinking of as like kind of the historic Church of England. 5, any matters relating to law and the church had to follow a very particular order, so that in the promulgation and execution of that law concerning ecclesiastical matters, they had to first go to the supreme civil magistrate, who would remand and recommend it to the ecclesiastical governors, and then they would deliver it to the rest of the pastors and they to the people. So you start with the king, and then it goes to the bishops, then to the clergy, then to the people. They say that order had been completely overlooked in this. Further, the promise clergy make at their ordination is to obey their bishops. In other words, ecclesiastical changes have to go through a correct hierarchy that starts with the king, and the obedience to one's bishop that you make at ordination is very much dependent upon that hierarchy. It's unclear, though, why they thought this would hold weight amongst a parliament that had abolished episcopacy. In the 6th point, they say the Church of Ireland is not subordinate unto or depending upon the convocation of any other church, and thus to accept something meant for the Church of England would betray, quote, the liberty of the Free National Church of Ireland. 7, the Church of Ireland had been built upon the use of the prayer book, and to get rid of it, they said, would be sinful. And finally, 8, to receive another form would justify the accusations of recusants, which is another word at this time for kind of underground Catholics, against the churches of England and Ireland, that the Reformation led in schism. So for the purposes of our time here together, I'd like to highlight one thing in particular about this list, although there are many remarkable things about it. Unlike any of the apologetics about the prayer book in England, the Dublin clergy's declaration makes mention of both England and Ireland and the importance of the freedom and ties between the two. We see these connections play out in really important ways throughout the 1640s and 50s. In their article on Episcopal ordinations in England from 1646 to 1660, Kenneth Fincham and Stephen Taylor note that it was 3 Irish bishops living in England who ordained 50% of the men seeking episcopal orders in England during this period. Quite clearly, they write, Episcopalians in England owed an enormous debt to bishops in the Church of Ireland. Thomas Fulwer, Bishop of Ardfert, he alone ordained 34% of ordinands in this period, estimated to be about 800 to 1,100 clergy. Thus, there's this important sense of connection between the two churches both in the sentiments expressed here, in the actions of the Irish bishops, and in the cross-travel and education between the two places. Nevertheless, in this document, the clergy are keen to assert their independence from the Church of England and to use that independence as a reason to resist Parliament's attempts to do to the Church of Ireland what it had done in England. This dual emphasis on the interconnections between the churches of England and Ireland, combined with the Second Protestation's focus on order and legality, is remarkable. The Second Protestation in particular is overtly concerned with asserting and preserving the Church of Ireland's independence. Now, this had not exactly been at the top of Archbishop William Laud's ecclesiastical honey-do list in the 1630s. Laud, with Lord Deputy of Ireland Thomas Wentworth and Bishop of Derry John Bramall, and John Bramall will become Archbishop of Armagh at the Restoration, so he's an important figure. They had been working to overturn that very independence in the 1630s and to bring the Church of Ireland under the umbrella of the Church of England even more than it already was. The Primate of Ireland at the time, James Usher, fought against this, in the end securing a kind of draw in which the Church of Ireland was de jure independent from England, while Laud and Wentworth had practical control all over the Church of Ireland through controlling patronage that allowed them to place prominent supporters of theirs in positions in the cathedrals and at Trinity College. By the 1640s, however, this attempted settlement begins to fall apart. Wentworth was executed in 1641, Laud in 1645. Bramall was arrested in 1642 and leaves Ireland, first going to England and then to the continent from 1648 to 1660. In other words, the practical control over the Church of Ireland by Laud and Company disappears over the course of the first half of the 1640s. What we see happen in the Second Protestation especially is the distinctiveness and independence of the Church of Ireland becoming a means of protecting the Church, a means harnessed by those who were part of a Laudian faction that was not originally interested in protecting that distinctiveness and independence in the first place. Ultimately, both protestations failed to make a difference in official policy, though until 1649, prayer book services continued in Dublin. Perhaps it is because they failed that historians have by and large overlooked these documents. Nevertheless, they provide us with important insights into the complex relationship between the Church of England and the Church of Ireland. Furthermore, they showcase the ways some within the Church of Ireland use the Church's distinctiveness and independence to continue that distinction by fighting for its very existence, an existence made even more remarkable by the dismantling of the Church of England accomplished in the preceding 2 years. What then does this have to do with the Anglican Communion? And how does this tale of the Dublin clergy's protestations change our approach to the Communion's history? The Dublin protestations from 1647 demonstrate the complexities of the Church of Ireland and the Church of England's relationship during the mid-17th century, and the ways some clergy in Dublin sought to maintain the liturgy of the Church by asserting its basic independence from the Church of England, though significantly not their independence from the King. In addition to contributing to our understanding of the early modern era, the history of the Church of Ireland further develops our notions about the beginnings of the Anglican Communion. Many of the dominant issues that emerged as the Communion developed in the 19th century may be seen, albeit in a slightly blurred fashion, in the ways the colonial Irish Church related to the Church of England. In order to see these issues, however, we must be willing to treat the Church of Ireland not simply as a part of the Church of England. While the Act of Union in 1800 officially created the United Church of England and Ireland, there were significant differences between the two before, during, and after the period of union from 1801 to 1871. How the two churches negotiated those differences is part and parcel of the story of the Anglican Communion. Now, when we think about Anglican Communion history, it typically places the origins of the Anglican Communion as a distinct communion within the 19th century, as the Church of England struggled to solve the ecclesiological problems raised by the British colonial project. While the American Church had addressed some of these at the end of the 18th century, as it sought to establish an American episcopate after the Revolutionary War, and a colonial bishop was finally provided for the colonies in British North America in Charles Inglis, there remained questions about the relationship between colonial churches, bishops, Parliament, and Canterbury. It was the search for answers to these questions, historians claim, that brought about the First Lambeth Conference and the beginnings of the Anglican Communion. At its earliest, historians have looked to the experiences of the Church in North America for the start of the path that led to the First Lambeth in 1867. In 1634, the Privy Council in England gave jurisdiction of overseas congregations and clergy to the Bishop of London, and that remained in force for almost 150 years. Such a policy brought obvious problems when one takes into account the realities of geography. As W.M. Jacobs notes in his History of the Communion's Development, this was meant to be an interim policy, for it is expected that as the colonies became more established, and the church with it, bishops would be necessary for the maintenance of the church and would thus be chosen for colonial bishoprics. The reality, however, was that there was no bishop appointed for the colonies who would be in the colonies until after the American Revolution, when Charles Inglis became Bishop of Nova Scotia in 1787. In the meantime, in the new United States, Samuel Seabury, William White, and Samuel Provost had all become bishops in the nascent American church. Seabury becoming Bishop of Connecticut in 1784 at his consecration in Aberdeen, and White and Provost bishops of Pennsylvania and New York in 1787 at the same service at Lambeth Palace. And the story of how they became bishops and the ramifications of this on American prayer book history are really fascinating and important, but that's another lunch and learn for another day. Now, the establishment of a colonial episcopate, as well as bishops in the United States of America, did not, in fact, solve the ecclesiological problems that had caused so many issues with the North American colonies in the 18th century. The 19th century witnessed the continued development of colonial churches and the eventual genesis of what we now call the Anglican Communion. Or, as William Sachs describes it, in the 19th century, quote, Anglicanism became a confederation of churches, paralleling the rise of the British Commonwealth. The connections between British imperialism and the Church of England were not new. These had been operative in the 18th century and were fundamental to understanding the church's development in Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries as well. Sachs claims that throughout their imperial experience, quote, Anglicans attempted to function as a local religious establishment, rooting the church more in local culture than in empire. One need only examine the lack of Gaelic resources in the Church of Ireland into the 17th century to see that this was not always the guiding ethos of the Church of England's colonial enterprises. By the 19th century, however, the church was often endeavoring to become more of a local religious establishment, and the conflicts of the mid-19th century arose from some of those efforts. The freedom of colonial churches, particularly around issues such as synods, became a key focus of ecclesiological debates in the 19th century. As Jacob's account highlights, by the mid-19th century, the churches in Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa were working to establish diocesan synods and provincial synods, though such moves were consistently resisted by Parliament. Parallel to this, there were changing ideas about the role of the English government in overseeing church affairs. Because of those disagreements within England, and despite the continued calls from colonial bishops to be given more freedom in the governance of their churches, Parliament consistently failed to pass any bills addressing the situation. In the end, many colonial bishops and their dioceses chose to act despite Parliament's inaction. The Bishop of Toronto met with clergy and lay representatives in October 1853, where they declared themselves a synod and petitioned the Queen for legislation to remove any doubts about the legality of church synods. Nova Scotia formed a synod in 1856, and in 1857, Anglican synods were given legal status by the Canadian legislature, and thereafter followed the creation of the Diocese of Huron and synods in Montreal, Quebec, Fredericton, and Ontario. The church in New Zealand became a province in 1858. Thus, these colonial churches are increasingly moving towards self-governance. Now, these moves towards greater independence are put to the test by the Colenso controversy in 1862. Which arose out of the church's work in South Africa. Robert Gray arrived in South Africa as Bishop of Cape Town in 1848, another high church bishop who wished to establish a synodical church government free from the constraints of the English political system. In 1852, Gray and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel had secured the funds to create two new dioceses in South Africa, Grahamstown and Natal. John Colenso was chosen for the post in Natal, and upon his arrival, he committed himself to working not only with the resident English, but with the local Zulu people who lived within his diocese. In his work in Natal and in his study of Zulu language and culture, Colenso would come to argue that the church should baptize those in polygamous marriages, though they should not marry again once baptized. Further, he sought to establish a school that used, quote, the medium of Zulu and which was steeped in local culture. This was alarming enough to Gray but things were made worse by the publication of two works of Colenso's biblical criticism. In Bishop Gray's opinion, Colenso's work on Romans failed to provide a sufficient account of the church's teaching about atonement, conversion, the church, and the sacraments. Gray asked Colenso to withdraw the book, but Colenso refused to do so, and so Gray referred the matter to Canterbury, who then referred the matter to a committee of bishops. In 1863, 2 years after Colenso published his commentary on Romans, the new Archbishop, Charles Longley, called a meeting of the English, Irish, and available colonial bishops to discuss the Colenso affair. The 41 bishops present approved a letter to Colenso, in which they asserted that his book on the Pentateuch, which Jacobs notes had become more important by this time than Romans, could not be reconciled with the promises that he'd made at his consecration, and that he should therefore resign as bishop. Gray, expecting this outcome, returned to South Africa in the meantime and opened a heresy trial against Colenso on the 16th of November, 1863, before which Colenso, who was in England, refused to appear. Gray went ahead and heard the evidence, declared Colenso guilty, and sentenced him to deposition. This would seem to end the matter, except that the ecclesiological murkiness of the relationship between the church in South Africa and the English state came into play. Colenso refused to accept the outcome of the trial, arguing that he could not be removed by Gray as he had been appointed by the Queen. The court sided with Colenso, though the church in South Africa had gone ahead and appointed a new bishop anyway. So Kevin Ward summarizes the situation as one in which, quote, two constitutional views of the Church of England and its relation to the wider Anglican communion were starkly outlined. While there had been a number of attempts to gather bishops from various parts of the communion before 1867, it was the Colenso affair and its attendant questions about the nature of the relationship between the English crown, the Church of England, and the Anglican churches throughout the world that finally led to the formal meeting that would become known as the Lambeth Conference, and thus the so-called official beginning of the Anglican Communion. And if you look at the picture, this is Bishop Gray, and that's Archbishop Longley right there. Now, what this very broad overview of Anglican ecclesiological developments leading to Lambeth highlights is that the question of the relationship between the Church of England and its colonial offshoots was never one that was particularly clear or easily resolved. Despite the obvious need for a bishop in the colonies to exercise basic pastoral oversight of the church and its members, it took a revolutionary war before any Anglican bishops were to be found in North America. Even once the need for those bishops was accepted, there was hesitancy to intrude upon other governments in the case of the United States, or to invest too much authority in the bishops themselves in the case of the colonies. Were these colonial churches meant to be the church in their particular location, or were they rather meant to be the Church of England in that particular locale? And the answer is not always clear. What the Irish example can help us realize, however, is that the answer has never been all that clear within Anglican history. In his essay on the Church of Ireland in Volume 2 of the Oxford History of Anglicanism, and it's worth noting this is the only essay in all 5 volumes of the series that treats Ireland as the only subject of inquiry, Toby Barnard writes, quote, "The Church of Ireland was conceived as a vital agent of Anglicization, but this role may have hampered its work. It needs also to be considered how far Anglicization and Anglicanism were synonymous. There were ways in which leaders of the Church of Ireland sought to adapt to local conditions. If this then meant some weakening of the Church's Anglicizing mission, did it also dilute the Anglicanism?" That Anglicizing mission was a vital part of the history of the Church of Ireland in the early modern period. As John McCafferty has outlined, none of the products of England's Reformation, the Act of Supremacy, the Prayer Book, the 39 Articles, the King James Version of the Bible, none of those were designed for or were remotely in response, he writes, to Irish conditions. Or, to put it in the words of another Irish historian, Alan Ford, the essential problem which dogged the Reformation throughout the 16th century and after was inherent in its very inception. It was conceived in England and imposed upon Ireland as an exercise in dynastic politics. What each of these authors is keen to point out, and what has been a guiding element of historical scholarship on the Irish Reformation, is that the Church of Ireland was intimately connected with the political motives of the Tudor, Stuart, and later regimes as part of a project to Anglicize the island and its people. At the same time, however, there was also an emerging Anglicanism that did not always line up with the state's Anglicizing project. Or, to put it another way, and this is deeply oversimplifying things, there is at times a politically driven top-down Anglicanism that is concerned with the continued connections to and influence from the Church of England. And there's a kind of bottom-up Anglicanism that embraces the things that we consider today to be central to Anglican identity, such as liturgy in the vernacular, local clergy, synodical governance, things like that. In this respect, the history of the Church of Ireland does not align neatly with 18th and 19th century British colonial projects. Clearly, we cannot and we should not try to map onto the 17th century those things which are particular to the Church in the 18th or 19th centuries. To do so would be anachronistic. Even the relationship between religion and politics in England was not the same from the 18th to the 19th century, much less from the 16th to the 19th, particularly with regards to the role of the state in managing the Church's affairs. The arguments from many of these 19th century bishops that the state had no role to play in the Church's life would have been utterly foreign to those in the Church of England in the 17th century, even when they were calling themselves a free national church. Even still, the clergy in Dublin are, when they call themselves a free national church, they're looking to the king for their authority to make decisions about themselves, not the convocation of a foreign church, which at that time they considered the Church of England to be. Despite the differences that exist between these historical periods, though, many of the ecclesiological issues at play in the 19th century, which grew from the larger issues of the relationship between the Church of England and the colonial churches, were appearing in early modern Ireland. It is not clear, then, why the Church of Ireland is consistently left out of our historical narrative, unless it is because scholars of Anglicanism generally fail to consider the Irish Church as being part of the British colonial project, as though that ended with the Act of Union in 1800 or with disestablishment in 1871. While there are clearly ways in which the relationship between Irish and English Anglicans is peculiar when compared with other colonial churches, it is still worth including in the narrative of the communion's development. The Lambeth Conference of 1930 defined the Anglican Communion as, quote, a fellowship within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, or regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury. Further, these churches uphold and propagate the faith and order of the church as found in the prayer book, as authorized in their several churches, are national or particular churches, and are bound together not by a central legislative and executive authority, but by a mutual loyalty sustained through the common council of the bishops in conference. The communion has been marked by this sometimes precarious balance between the independence of each province and communion with one another in the See of Canterbury. The 19th century witnessed extensive negotiations of this relationship as growing colonial churches sought clarity on issues related to authority between themselves and Canterbury, while the American and Scottish churches looked to clarify their relationship with England as well. While the Lambeth Conference in 1867 is often looked to as the genesis of the communion, or the Colenso affair as being the true start, one could just as easily point to the 150th anniversary celebrations of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in the 1850s, when Anglican bishops from around the world gathered and spoke of communion. Robert Bosher records it as the first time representation from all churches in communion with Canterbury was such that the lengthy celebration was analogous, he says, to a pan-Anglican Congress. Both in the reasons for those gatherings and in the history of non-English Anglican churches, one could summarize the history of the Anglican Communion as one of constantly negotiated relationship. The history of the Church of Ireland shows a colonial church trying to determine issues of authority and independence with the Church of England in ways that are not exactly like, but precursors to, issues that would arise later in the 18th and 19th centuries. The authors of the protestation against the prescription of the prayer book noted that, quote, laying aside thereof and the receiving of the directory or any other form would be, we conceive, a departing in this from the communion of the Church of England and Ireland. They do not mean here a communion in the same sense that the bishops at Lambeth in 1930 meant it, but there's clearly a close relationship between the two that is informing the protesters' response. And yet, despite that communion, the authors state that theirs is and ever was reputed a free national church and not subordinate unto or depending upon the convocation of any other church. This statement would not have been universally accepted amongst the Irish clergy in the 17th century, and thus not amongst the English clergy, and certainly not amongst the English clergy. As would be the case in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States, the relationship between the local church and the Church of England was not only constantly contested and negotiated between those churches, but within the local church as well. To trace the history of the Anglican Communion proper back into the 17th century would not necessarily change the end of the story. The Americans' need for a bishop will still shape English responses to bishops in the colonies, and Colenso's controversy will still lead to the Lambeth Conference. However, including the Church of Ireland's history as part of the story of the Anglican Communion not only gives us a richer narrative for the Communion's development, but it also forces us to take seriously the longevity of colonialism within the Anglican tradition and its continued impact on the Church today. Further, it gives us a greater understanding of how questions of liturgy, relationship, and ecclesiological authority have always been central to Anglicanism, thereby giving us a longer perspective on how the central issues of the 19th century debates that led to Lambeth and a more coherent Anglican communion developed not only out of the missional ventures of the modern era, but also out of the crucible of colonialism and reform that marked the early modern period. In their book, The Promise of Anglicanism, Robert Haney and William Sachs write that, quote, Anglicanism is neither strictly magisterial nor entirely confessional. It claims the grounding of apostolicity understood as the continuation of gospel witness across time and cultures. Thus, Anglicanism emerges in mission. Anglican life occurs at various levels, and so its promise must be viewed. While the idea of Anglicanism in the early modern period is itself contested, the seeds of the promise to which Haney and Sachs refers lie not solely within the English Church, but also in its encounter with Irish, Scottish, and Welsh Christians in the 16th and 17th centuries. Including these voices in our common narrative will acknowledge the complexities of our history and give us a better understanding of ourselves as we move forward in communion, not English, but Anglicanism. Thank you. And I think at this point we move to Q&A, which I believe Mary Catherine is going to help us moderate.
Yes, I am happy to start with that. If you have any questions or comments, there should be a little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and also a chat. So feel free to throw those in either one. We're going to start off. Can you give us maybe some book recommendations for further reading?
That's tricky because there aren't, a lot of this is kind of spread out in articles amongst things. One of the best books is W.M. Jacobs. I think it's called The Shaping of the Communion. I can't remember the exact title. Actually, I can because it's in my footnotes. And he really it's an old school institutional history of, the making of the Anglican Church worldwide. This is a very institutional history of how the Anglican Church was formed and how it developed. There's not really a single book that covers the 1650s. The church in Ireland in the 1650s. I highly recommend the first volume of the Oxford History of Anglicanism, which deals with the early modern period. There is a chapter that deals with Ireland and Scotland, but also some of the ins and outs of the political and religious machinations of the period. And I thought I had it, but Alan Ford has written a book on the Irish Reformation. This is the tricky thing about, like, when I said historians don't really write about this period, they really don't write about this period in books. It's in a number of articles and such. But the Oxford volume is a great starting point if you want to know more about the church in the early modern period and getting a sense of how early modern Anglicanism is forming. And the Jacobs is a great book if you're interested in the formation of the Anglican Communion and how that gets going over time and how it institutionally develops. Though, as I said, you can challenge him and you can push back at places.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any questions or comments. I'm gonna encourage you guys. Now is the time. If you have any, throw them in there. Sometimes it takes a little while for them to come through, but any other closing thoughts, I guess?
Just that, it's one of those, most people who don't go to seminary don't, unless you've really studied British and Irish history closely, don't know that the prayer book was illegal for a time. And that there is this fascinating period in the mid-17th century when the church is really being suppressed. And out of that, we get the formation of Anglicanism. But thinking about our church from the beginning as a kind of colonial church, right? The colonial aspects are there from the very beginning, right? So we tend to think of colonialism and Anglicanism being an output of the modern period. So maybe the British Empire, and we start thinking about the 18th and 19th century and all that's going on there. And it's really there from the very beginning. And so all of these questions about the relationship between local churches and the Church of England, and how do issues of, there's not an Irish prayer book until I think it's 1604 or 1607. The Bible is not translated into Irish completely until the later part of the 17th century. I think it's around 1685 when we have the entire Bible in Irish. So there's all of these complicated aspects to it that start much earlier than we give them, we typically think. And so I find it helpful for us to think of these constantly negotiated relationships as being there from the beginning, and really shaping how we think about ourselves and how we talk about it. Tim, I see your question. So
okay. I was gonna make
what's
sure
the sense of identity amongst the Irish Anglicans now? The sense I have is that they function rather independently as generically Protestant. Do they have a strong sense of Anglican identity now? I think part of the tricky nature of that question is that the Church of Ireland now, as it was then, right, is the entire island, but the island is two distinct political entities. So you've got the United Kingdom, which includes Northern Ireland, and then you've got the Republic of Ireland. And both of those are within the same province. So that's one of the unique aspects of the Church of Ireland. And this kind of only exists in a couple of places throughout the communion, as far as I know. I could be misspeaking, but I'm pretty sure it's fairly rare. So you do have this very different sense. And so that sense of identity is very much shaped by where you live. So if you live in Northern Ireland, that identity as a member of the Church of Ireland and as being Anglican carries a very particular political weight that tracks differently in the Church of Ireland. And so, I mean, amongst the Irish Anglicans, I know they have a sense of themselves as Anglican. But so I think it's hard to kind of make a giant sweeping statement like that, but it's key to remember that there are two very different political entities that are within the Church of Ireland, and they're constantly trying to negotiate between those. And, I think last time I'd heard that the greatest membership of the Church of Ireland is in Northern Ireland, but like the provincial see is in is in the Republic and all of that. So it gets complicated. So there's one question. Do I think we should be wary of new experimental liturgies that incorporate culture and contemporary issues? I think one of the things that this work has done for me, so my dissertation that I'm working on the book for was about, so when the prayer book is illegal, during that period, there are some alternative liturgies written by Anglicans, and they're protesting Cromwell's position and Cromwell's state and church and all the things that have been happening. The liturgy has always been responding to our culture and is always responding to the place that we're at. The fact that 1662 has lasted for so long is deeply tied to very particular historical and political contingencies that we didn't get into today. But 1662 comes about as it does because they're coming out of these 15 years or 20 years really of war and upheaval. So they're like, we're just going to get this book in. Like, they'd been having some meetings to try and do greater revisions. It didn't happen. They actually start to revise the book in around 1688. But then the Glorious Revolution happens, which is essentially a political coup. And so those revisions fall apart, and there's not a mechanism put in place in the Church of England to revise liturgy in that way. So I think when we think about Anglican liturgy outside of the Church of England, we can see responses to particular places, but liturgy should always be enculturated, right? It should always be connected to the culture of where it is. The Gospels from the very beginning were enculturated. And so I think that's there, but there's always the challenge of balancing, tradition and the realities of where we're at and creating liturgies that are going to still have meaning, 10 years down the road. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but nobody, when they're writing a liturgy, really kind of knows that it's going to feel dated in 10 years. So I think that's a balance to be struck. But this work has constantly been a reminder to me that Anglican liturgy from the beginning is responding to its very particular historical and cultural realities. And that we run into issues sometimes in places like Ireland where the liturgy was not given the cultural connections that it needed to have, right? They don't put it into Irish for a long time. They do put it into Welsh much more quickly for different reasons. And the church takes hold in Wales in ways it doesn't in Ireland. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. How does the development of the Irish language prayer book fit into the distinct Irishness of the Church of Ireland? I mean, if we're thinking about in the early modern period, and there are people who work on this much more closely than I do, but a lot of people in the Church of Ireland in the 17th century don't necessarily speak Irish. A lot of them are anglicized Irish. A lot of them are English who come over to Ireland. And so Irish is not something they know. There are many who do, right? So James Usher is fluent in Irish. He knows Irish. There are some who do, but I don't think that the linguistic connection with that identity is as strong then as it is now. And they do have this problem in the late 16th century or in the 16th century of trying to get clergy who can speak Irish or English clergy to come over who will learn Irish. And this is still some of the issue. How does the 1662 book react against the directory? So yeah, there's a great bit in the preface to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, where Robert Sanderson, who's one of the people who writes one of these alternative liturgies I was talking about, who supposedly wrote the preface, says, we're trying to get something that's a moderate. It's basic. He puts it, mine is on a bookshelf over there, so I'm not going to skip out and get it unless it's right here. Oh no, it's right here. He talks about how this prayer book is meant to be almost like a moderate prayer book that moderate people can use. And in that way, it is very much a reaction against the directory. Like just having a set liturgy in its own is a reaction against, okay, so here's what he says in 1662. This is the 1662 prayer book. Our general aim, therefore, in this undertaking was not to gratify this or that party in any of their unreasonable demands, but to do that which to our best understandings we conceived might most tend to the preservation of peace and unity in the church, the procuring of reverence, and exciting of piety and devotion in the public worship of God, and the cutting off occasion from them that seek occasion or cavil or quarrel against the liturgy of the church. So they're very clear that they're, creating a set liturgy that in itself is a reaction against the directory. And they're doing so in such a way that people aren't going to be able to spend their time slandering the liturgy, but they're going to get rid of the extemporaneous prayers that we're bringing in heretical theologies. They're going to get rid of things that could lead to sectarianism and all of that. But the Irish protests against the directory don't play into that conception. The restoration happens in different places, in different ways in Ireland than it does in the Church of England. So the Church of England takes a much longer time to get the episcopacy reestablished, and the Irish managed to get it quickly. It happens much more quickly there. And so this is one of those places where we see the Church of Ireland functioning with a certain amount of independence, and also still being very connected in different ways. And so 1662 is reactionary against the directory in that it is, just the fact that it's a set liturgy, right? And saying that the church is going back to this is key. And there was a proposed liturgy presented by, why am I losing his name? Richard Baxter, at the Savoy Conference in 1660, when they're starting to try and put together a new prayer book. And so there's basically those who were more Presbyterian minded, led by Baxter, and those who wanted the Church of England as it had been. And Baxter says, well, look, here's a prayer book here's a liturgy that's like what we would use. Just, this is an example. And they say no. And so the 1662 book itself, just the fact that it's there, the fact that it's large, it's different from 1559, but in lots of ways very similar. The fact that that exists is a reaction against what the Westminster Assembly had tried to do. So I hope that answered everybody's questions. It's all very muddled and complicated in lots of fun and interesting ways. But and also can lead us down all sorts of rabbit holes. But those are, like I said, future lunch and learns.
Right now, that's all the questions that we had in the chat. I'll give it one more minute. We do have time for one more if any come through. I did want to say it wasn't a question, but it did come through on the chat. Excellent presentation, fascinating.
Oh.
So I wanted to echo that. I will say, just want to say thank you, Hilary, for being with us today and for sharing with us. And thanks to everybody that attended. If Hilary, you want to go to the
I'm trying. There we
next
go.
slide.
Okay.
There we go. Upcoming Lunch and Learn series for our Advent term. So this is everything that is happening before the end of the year. Rob McSwain on October 24th, and then Becky Wright on November 11th. There'll be more things floating around advertising these, but just kind of give you a little save the date. And then lastly, if you visit theology.sewanee.edu/lectures-events, that's everything that's happening for the year. There's some more things happening before the end of this calendar year, and then it has the Lunch and Learns also for the Easter term. So I invite you to take a look at that and encourage you to sign up for maybe some of our other upcoming events. Thank you all for being here, and we appreciate it and hope to see you soon, whether it's at the St. Luke's lectures or online at one of these future events. Appreciate you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.